This video is meant to demonstrate lists and loops when using Scratch. So I'm going to create a project that adds the first n numbers using lists and loops to help us go through these lists. And by adding the first n numbers, so if I said n is 5, you would add 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. So obviously if you made n 100, it's going to add those first 100 numbers. Now I do want to say that there is a much simpler way of doing this. You don't need to actually use a list. You can just use the series summation that is well known in mathematics. The sum of the first n numbers is n times n plus 1 divided by 2. If you're interested in the reasons why, I will put a link in the description so that you can check it out. It is kind of cool why that works, but out of scope here. So basically, I want to show you what's inside the code so far. So I have a little shell of a project here. So let me show you what I have. I wanted to put together a way to check that we have the right result. So down here, when I get a certain message, it's going to sum it using that summation. So basically what it's doing here, and I'm doing a little check to make sure the n that you're giving me is a number bigger than 0. But if it is some series, that's a variable. So I'm going to take the number to add, that's n, and then I'm going to multiply it by n plus 1, that's over here, and then I'm going to divide the whole thing by 2. And this is how I'm going to check, did I get the right answer? So if I change a number to add, and I'm going to do it just sneaking over here by the side, if I change that number to 2, right? If number to add is now 2, and I'll display that. And if I run through this code, well, I get the correct answer of 3, because if that's 2, that's n plus 1 over 2, you get 3. So it's just a way to check that my loops are and my list is being processed correctly. So let's look at the list here. So I'm going to erase it just to show you what it would look like if I didn't have a list. So if you start a project, you want a list, you press the Make a List button, and so this will pop up, and I'm going to make it for all sprites, though you could make it for this sprite only, which is fine here. And so it's going to create this list, which it's displaying by default, and it's just like any variable. If you check this box, you see it. If you uncheck it, you don't. And it's a list of items. So most languages have some kind of capability like this. So a list, strictly speaking, is when you have some linked items together that you can get to the first one, you can get to the last one. There's usually some way to traverse the list, which means you can go from a first to a second to a third, maybe even go a previous to a next one. And there's also something called an array that most languages have, and this is a data structure that is indexed. So you can say, show me the first item in my array, show me the 10th item in my array. And it looks like Scratch has made their list data structure kind of a combination of both those things. So we will look a little bit closer at that. So I have 3 blocks that we're going to work on here, and I'm going to move my old-fashioned way a little bit out of the way. And so the first thing I want to do is initialize the list, that is, add some values. So let's take a look at some of the things that we can do with lists. So this popped up when we created one. So you can add items to a list. So in this case, it's defaulting to add thing, but they can be strings, they can be numbers, whatever you want to add to your list. This one says delete the first item in my list. Now you have other choices here. That's what the little flag is. You can type in any number. So if you want to get rid of the 3rd item in your list, make that a 3. You can say get rid of the last one. You can say get rid of all of them. You can also insert things at a certain position. So you could put it in the first item. I don't know what happens if you have an empty list and you say put it in as the 3rd item. I'm not quite sure what that means. You can insert it at the end, the last. You can and create a random location for them if you wanted to. Maybe that would help in a game of chance. And since I clicked on this, it actually inserted that thing. You can replace an item with something else at a certain indexed item. Now lists in Scratch appear to start at 1 as its first index item, which sounds usual, but many languages start at 0. So in Scratch it starts at 1. So you can replace it, I guess, with a different value. So I guess if I type something else in here, maybe it'll work. Well, can't get to it. We don't have to do that here. You can also access the list. So if I wanted to set a variable equal to a certain item. You can say set it to item 1, 2, 3. You can say set it to the last one, and I guess even set it to a random element in the list. And again, if you're creating a game, maybe that's something you'd want to do. You can also get the length of the list, how many items are in the list. And I can see from my printout I've got 1, but if I need it in my program, in my project, the code, I can say how many things are in this list. I can use this and set a variable equal to it perhaps. You can search in there, does my list contain a thing? And you're going to get a true or false back. If I click here, it does say true, whoops, because thing is in the list. If I was searching on something else, it might give me a false because there is no item with nothing in it. You can show a list, which it's already shown, and again through the code, or you can hide it through the code, just like you can any other variable. So those are the kinds of things we have to work with. So I'm going to start with the easiest one, clear list, which should be pretty easy because I'm going to take this delete and I'm going to say all of it. So if I click here, it knows to empty my list. And sometimes you want to do that. So I'm going to have that just here in case I need it. But let's go to the initialize one. So initialize the list. I created kind of the shell of that block, and let's just go into here to see what I did. It's initialized list, and it has one parameter that you can pass in. If you click on options when you create a block, you can say I want a number input, a string input, a Boolean input, which is a true or a false, so you can have that in there as well. And you can put a little comment here, which I did. So I added a number input, I'm calling it n, and that's how many numbers you want to add. So that's how it was created, so we need to kind of code that up. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to use a loop that goes n times, so that I can put n of these numbers in there. And I want n to be 1, then or the values rather to be 1, then 2, then 3. So I created a variable called counter to kind of count my way through that list. And when I start, I want to make sure that I'm at some initial value here. So I'm just going to call it 0 when I first come through this list. And I'm going to go to my control statements, and I'm going to want to do this n times. So I'm going to repeat it n times. But what am I going to do for those times? Well, the first thing that I want to go into list is the number 1. Now my counter is 0. So I am going to change counter by 1. So now when it's 0, it comes here the first time through. The 0 becomes 0 plus 1, or 1. And then I want to add it to my list. So I'm going to, I guess, insert the counter at 1 of my list. So initialize this n times says do that. Go through it that many times. So counter at 1 to the end of my list. Hopefully that's enough to get there. So let's see. What is n? I don't know if I can set n. Let me see. I'm going to actually just create a little block. So here's the block. Let's say I want it to be the number 5. If I click on here, it's doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It actually did 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is fine. If I want it to go the other way, I think I can do that. Let's see, I think I want to add it rather than insert it. Let's try that just to see if it goes to the correct spot. I'll take this out. And I'm going to clear my list out so there's nothing there. And then let's try it again. Click this guy. Yeah. It's fine the way it was, but it shows us the difference between insert and add. So the insert, it put it at 1, so it was always putting it as the first item in my list, whereas the add puts it at the end of the list. So learned a little something there. I did too. And the problem I have here is that if I do click this again, instead of just putting 5 things in here, it's putting 10. So it's actually doing the first 5 and then it's adding another. And now let's say I wanted to add the first 10. If I click it now, it's like I've got all these things on my list. So one thing I probably should do is clear out the list each time. So I'm going to add a clear list at the beginning of this, so that now if I want a list of 10 of these numbers, it's only putting in 10 of them now because I'm emptying it out first. And this is exactly what I want. So I've added an initial value in there, and then I need to add them up. So I'm going to create, or I have created, a variable called sum, which I can display for the time being, which has a value. So I'm just going to initialize that so it doesn't look like anything. So you have this variable called sum, and I want it to actually add up, collect all the values that we're adding here. And there are ways, several ways to do this. There's always more than one way. So I'm going to do it this way, which is because I saw that initialize bug or problem here, I want to make sure that it's always 0 when I start. And then I want to have a loop that goes through this list. So I'm going to go back here. Now this time, instead of doing a repeat, I'm going to do a repeat until. And what a repeat until does, it will keep running through this loop until the condition I put in here is true. Or it does it when it's true, and then it stops when it's false. So you can have a loop stop that way. And the question is, well, how many times do I want to do this? Well, let's think about what I want to do. So when I start through here, my sum is 0, but I'm going to want to change its value. I'm going to want to change the value of sum, which is collecting all those things, by a list item value. So let's see, I want to set it by, I'm going to take the first item. So the first time through, it's going to find that number 1, and it's going to add it to the sum to be 0 plus 1. Now the next time through, I don't want it to be 1, I need it to be 2. So there are various ways I can do that, where I perhaps reference it using some of these things here, where I say item 2, item 3, and I can do it that way. I think what I'm going to do though is I'm going to actually take the list item off. So this list, once I'm kind of done with it, I don't really need item 1 anymore. And that means the next time through, item 1 will be what's in item 2. And so that way I can just keep popping them off the list as I keep going. But I have to know when to stop. So when I stop, I need to check, and I'm going to put an equal here, I need to check that there's still items in the list. And one way to do that is to look at the length of the list. So I'm going to repeat this until the length of the list is 0. And I suppose I could do something where the length of the list maybe is less than 1. It's fine the way it is though. So the first time through, if there's nothing in this list, the length of the list will be 0. So repeat until this becomes true. It would be true the first time. But if it's more than 1, if you have items on there, it will go through the length because that'll be false. So in this case, like over here, the length is 10. So 10 is not 0. So this is false. So it will go through the loop. But remember that I'm taking something off each time. So you go through, you go through, you go through. Eventually, as I keep popping them off, this will become 0. So I think I can just run it from here, and we'll see what sum comes out to. So if I click here, so hopefully it goes by really fast, but it went through that list, and it just added until there was nothing left on the list. So I think I've got some good functions here. Now it's kind of going up here to the kind of the meat of this, like how do you get things started. So I actually have 2 ways to kind of receive this QScratchy message. One is when the green flag is clicked, it goes right in there. It says QScratchy, which will do this. I also have the add button. And so when this sprite is clicked, the add button is clicked, it will also broadcast QScratchy. So there's a couple of ways to get there. And the first thing Scratchy is going to do is ask, how many do you want to add? And so I'm going to put that answer in a variable called number to add, which we can just stick this here just to see what it is. And from a previous run, it was at 2. And then it does a check. So I definitely, first of all, it's very good practice. Whenever you have the user do anything, you want to verify that the input they are entering, you can handle anything. So in this case, I want my numbers to be positive numbers. I want them to be nice counting numbers. 1 doesn't really make sense because if you're adding the first 1 number, that's just 1. So I want a number that's bigger than 1. And I had to add this because I found when I was playing around with this thing that if my number to add, my n, got too big, Scratch would just kind of die. I would blow up Scratch. It would just run and disappear and never stop. However, if I did it through my little old-fashioned way, I could add much bigger numbers because it's not going through a list. So my suspicion is these lists take up a bit of memory, and if you make this number too big, Scratch can't handle it. So I was able to get 1,000 to work, but if I got much bigger than that, I would sometimes have bad results. So I decided to say I want the number to be a number between 1 and 1,000. So I said if it's bigger than 1 and at the same time it's smaller than, say, 1,001, which lets you do 1,000, then go ahead and calculate an answer. Now there is an else here, so if they type something in that's invalid, it says pick a number bigger than 1 and smaller than 1,000. So it gives the user a clue about what they're allowed to input. And that's always good practice whenever you have a user involved to check kind of what they're typing in. So right now, all that this does is when you put in a valid input, it's broadcasting my sum the old-fashioned way. And that's this one down here, and it's the one that uses the n times n plus 1 over 2 thing. So I'm using that just as a check that my list stuff is working. So I need to kind of code that up. So I'm going to get rid of that thing. So what do? I have a valid number. So I'm going to go to these blocks I created, and I am going to add an initialized list. Now how many? Well, they type that in. So where is that thing? Number 2, add. So the first thing I do is initialize a list to have the number of things that I want to add, and then I'm going to want to add those numbers up. So I'm going to put add numbers here, and add numbers should be creating the sum variable, so I want to kind of have Scratchy tell us what it was. So I could just have Scratchy say n, but I would like something a little bit more elegant than that. So I created this thing called data string, or answer string rather, and so I want to set that. So I'm going to set my answer string using the join operator here so that it makes somewhat a sense of what Scratchy's telling us. So the sum of the first n letters, but what is n? N is that number to add. So I'm going to put that right here. And I still want a little more to say. So I'm going to set my answer string again to another join. Here it is. Well, to what? Well, what I already had an answer string, which is the sum of the first n, whatever n is, and then kind of finish the thought here. And I'm putting a little space here so it's spaced nicely. The sum of the first n numbers is, and then let's kind of finish the thought. Put another join. And so the answer string now should say the sum of the first n numbers is, then I have to put what more sum is, which is sum. I just want to make sure I have a space at the end of this so it looks good. Okay, I think I do. I don't know. So there's a lot of coding here. Ordinarily, you would kind of be running and checking things as you go. But let's just see. I feel like I've probably left something out. I always do. So let's just run it and see what happens. So if I press my add button, it's saying how many numbers would you like to add. Now when I add my number, I should get my sum series. And remember, that's kind of using the formula. That one I know is correct. And then this is whatever shows up in Scratchy's voice here, which actually I have to have him say something, don't I? No, I forgot something. So we're going to have Scratchy say answer string, just so we can see it. So if I type in a 10 here, and I click my checkbox, so what happened? So some of the series came up right away, because that's a very easy little calculation. Boom, it's out. Now we saw, if you looked quickly, we can run it again, that the list was created, and then it went through that list, kind of deleting it as it went. And so it looks pretty good. Let's try bigger numbers here. So if I do say 50, right? Some of the first 50 numbers. Now again, my sum series comes right out there. And it's working its way through, and it gets the correct number, but look how much longer it took. Now this is kind of an interesting thing here because I think this is working. I have most of this stuff displayed as more debug, but I don't really need them anymore. So I don't need to see number to add, and I don't need to see sum, and I certainly don't need my list anymore. Let's see what happens if I try 50 again. So if I do 50, remember that took a long time. But once I stopped displaying that stuff, it went pretty quickly. So actually displaying this list and having it go and displaying all those things, that's what took the long time, not the actual calculation itself. So it's a very good thing to have for debug, but then when you're kind of think everything is working, you can just take it all down. And so it looks like it's working. Can I add the first 100 numbers? Whoops, didn't want to type. There it is. Okay, now it said I could do 1,000. Let's hope it works and I don't blow up Scratch again. Ooh, that worked great, but what happens if I try to go bigger? If I try to do 10,000 numbers, well, I've got my my check in there, so it doesn't get that big, so I don't kind of ruin Scratch. At least I have numbers that work. Now, if you wanted to have one that added more, you can just get rid of all this list stuff and just use the old-fashioned way. But the whole point here was to kind of see how lists work and get familiar with them, how different loops can affect things, and so forth. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it made sense. Thanks for watching, and happy Scratch coding.